The morning sun cast golden rays across the palace gardens as tourists gathered behind the velvet ropes. Among them stood Sarah Mitchell, a 28-year-old teacher from Boston who had saved for 3 years to make this trip to England. She clutched her camera with sweaty palms, her heart racing with excitement as she gazed at the magnificent palace before her. The royal guards stood like statues at their posts, their red uniforms pristine and their tall bearskin hats adding to their imposing presence. Sarah had read all about them before her trip. She knew they were highly trained soldiers, not just decorative figures for tourists to photograph. Yet, like many visitors, she couldn't help but be fascinated by their unwavering stillness. She moved closer to get a better photograph, careful to stay behind the designated line. The guard closest to her was tall with a strong jawline visible beneath his chin strap. His blue eyes stared straight ahead, never flickering, never acknowledging the dozens of tourists snapping photos just feet away from him. Sarah took several pictures, then lowered her camera. She watched him for a moment, wondering what it must be like to stand so still for hours, to ignore the constant chatter and camera flashes, to remain professional despite the heat and discomfort. A small smile crossed her lips as she thought about how difficult that must be. That's when she noticed something that made her heart sink. A group of teenage boys had started acting foolishly near another guard down the line. They were making faces, trying to get him to react, their voices growing louder and more obnoxious with each failed attempt. Other tourists were watching uncomfortably, but no one said anything. Sarah felt a wave of secondhand embarrassment wash over her. These guards were doing their job, serving their country, and they deserved respect. She turned her attention back to the guard in front of her, silently apologizing on behalf of all the rude tourists who didn't understand the dignity of what these soldiers did. As she stood there, lost in thought, Sarah didn't notice that she had unconsciously taken a small step forward. Her foot crossed the white line painted on the ground. It was just an inch, maybe 2, but it was enough. The change in the guard was instantaneous. His rifle moved with practiced precision, the movement so sudden and sharp that Sarah jumped backward with a gasp. Her camera nearly slipped from her hands. The guard's voice rang out, clear and commanding, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. "Step back behind the line." Every tourist in the vicinity froze. Cameras stopped clicking. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned to Sarah, whose face had gone pale. She stumbled backward, her hands shaking as she clutched her camera to her chest. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't paying attention. I'm so sorry." The guard returned to his position, rifle back in place, eyes forward once more. But Sarah couldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, mortification flooding through her entire body. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She wasn't crying because she'd been yelled at. She was crying because she'd been disrespectful, even if accidentally. Around her, she could hear whispers. Some tourists were pointing at her. Others were already moving away, as if afraid she might cause more trouble. A few were taking pictures of her, which made everything worse. Sarah wanted to disappear, to sink into the ground and never be seen again. But instead of running away like every instinct told her to do, Sarah did something unexpected. She took a deep breath, wiped her eyes quickly, and looked directly at the guard. She knew he couldn't acknowledge her, knew he had to maintain his post, but she needed to do this anyway. "I truly apologize," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying across the sudden quiet. "You're doing an important job, and I should have been more careful. Thank you for your service." She didn't wait for a response she knew wouldn't come. Instead, she gave a small, respectful nod and began to walk away, her cheeks still burning with shame. The crowd parted slightly as she moved through it, and she could feel dozens of eyes following her every step. What Sarah didn't see was the slight twitch at the corner of the guard's mouth. What she didn't know was that his name was James Henderson, and in his 7 years as a royal guard, no tourist had ever apologized to him like that. Sarah found a bench far from the palace gates and sat down heavily. Her hands were still trembling as she pulled out her phone to text her sister back home. But before she could type anything, she noticed a small crowd had gathered near where she'd been standing. Curious despite her embarrassment, she watched from a distance. The teenage boys who had been harassing the other guard earlier were now focused on James. They'd apparently decided that since one guard had reacted to someone crossing the line, they would try to provoke a response too. But they were doing it deliberately, mockingly, inching closer to the line and laughing among themselves. Sarah felt anger rise in her chest, replacing her embarrassment. She stood up, uncertain of what she was going to do, but knowing she couldn't just sit there and watch. These boys were doing exactly what she'd accidentally done, but with malicious intent. They were treating a decorated soldier like he was part of a game. Just as she took a step forward, a palace official in a dark suit approached the group. His voice was polite but firm as he asked the boys to move along. They protested, claiming they weren't doing anything wrong, but the official's steady gaze and professional demeanor left no room for argument. Reluctantly, they shuffled away, still laughing and making jokes. Sarah sat back down, relieved but still upset. She spent the next hour wandering through the palace gardens, taking pictures of flowers and fountains, but her mind kept drifting back to that moment. She thought about the discipline it must take to stand in one position for hours. She thought about the training these guards went through, the commitment they'd made to serve. Most of all, she thought about how tourists like her, even with good intentions, sometimes forgot that these were real people with real feelings beneath those impressive uniforms. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah decided to head back to her hotel. She took one last walk past the palace gates, staying well behind the lines this time. The guards had changed shifts, and James was no longer at his post. A part of her was relieved. Another part wished she could have somehow conveyed her respect one more time. She stopped at a small shop near the palace that sold postcards and souvenirs. As she browsed, an elderly woman behind the counter smiled at her. "First time visiting the palace, dear?" Sarah nodded, managing a small smile. "Yes, though I'm afraid I'll be remembered for all the wrong reasons." The woman raised an eyebrow, and Sarah found herself telling the whole story. When she finished, she expected judgment, but the woman's expression was kind. "You know," the old woman said softly, "my grandson is a royal guard. He's told me stories about tourists over the years. The rude ones, the ones who try to make them laugh or get angry, the ones who treat them like props instead of people. But he's also told me about the rare ones who show genuine respect. Those are the ones they remember, dear, not because of mistakes but because of character." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes again, but this time they were different. "Thank you," she whispered. "I needed to hear that." As she left the shop and walked back to her hotel through the bustling London streets, Sarah felt something shift inside her. Her embarrassing moment at the palace hadn't ruined her trip. If anything, it had taught her something valuable about respect, dignity, and the importance of acknowledging the humanity in everyone, no matter what uniform they wore or what job they performed. What she didn't know was that her story was far from over. What she couldn't possibly imagine was that her brief encounter with James Henderson would lead to something neither of them could have predicted. Sometimes the most meaningful connections begin with mistakes, with moments of vulnerability, with simple acts of genuine respect in a world that too often forgets the value of such things. 3 days had passed since the incident at the palace, and Sarah had tried to put it behind her. She'd spent her time exploring London museums, walking along the Thames, and visiting every bookshop she could find. Yet every time she passed someone in a uniform, every time she saw a photograph of the palace, her mind drifted back to that moment and to the guard whose name she didn't even know. On Thursday morning, Sarah decided to visit the Churchill War Rooms, the underground headquarters where Winston Churchill and his cabinet directed World War II operations. She'd always been fascinated by history, and this museum had been high on her list of places to see. As she descended the stairs into the preserved underground tunnels, the air grew cooler and the sounds of modern London faded away. The museum was quieter than she'd expected for a Thursday morning, with only a handful of other visitors scattered throughout the rooms. Sarah moved slowly through the exhibits, reading every placard, studying every photograph. She paused in the map room, where colored pins still marked positions from decades ago, frozen in time like a moment captured in amber. She was so absorbed in reading about the daily routines of the people who had worked in these cramped, windowless spaces that she didn't notice someone had stopped beside her. "It's remarkable, isn't it?" a male voice said softly. Thinking about the weight of the decisions made in these rooms, Sarah looked up and felt her heart stop. Standing next to her, dressed in civilian clothes, a navy sweater and jeans, was the guard from the palace. She recognized him instantly. Those same blue eyes, that strong jawline, But now his expression was relaxed, almost gentle, so different from the stern mask he'd worn while on duty. He seemed to recognize her too, because a flicker of something, surprise perhaps or acknowledgement, crossed his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sarah's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. Should she apologize again? Should she pretend she didn't recognize him? Should she just walk away? Before she could decide, he extended his hand. "James Henderson," he said simply. She took his hand, noting its firm grip. "Sarah Mitchell. I'm the person who crossed the line at the palace. I'm still mortified about that." To her surprise, a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "I know, I was there." Then his expression softened further. "You don't need to be mortified. You apologized with more grace than most people would have managed. Trust me, I've seen much worse." They stood there for a moment, hands still clasped, before both realizing and pulling away at the same time. An awkward silence followed, broken by James clearing his throat. "Are you enjoying the museum?" Sarah nodded, grateful for the normal question. "It's incredible. I teach history back in Boston, so places like this are like candy stores for me." She paused, then added, "Are you here on duty or just visiting?" "Just visiting. It's my day off, and I try to come here every few months. There's something about this place that puts things in perspective, you know? Reminds me why the traditions and protocols we maintain at the palace matter. They're part of something bigger." Sarah found herself fascinated by this side of him. The stoic guard from the palace had transformed into a thoughtful, articulate man with opinions about history and duty. They began walking through the museum together, naturally falling into step beside each other. As they moved through the cabinet war rooms, they talked about history, about the difference between American and British perspectives on the war, about the personal sacrifices made by ordinary people during extraordinary times. James shared stories his grandmother had told him about living through the Blitz, and Sarah told him about her grandfather who had served in the Pacific Theater. "You said you're a teacher?" James asked as they stood in Churchill's modest bedroom, looking at the simple bed where one of history's most influential leaders had snatched brief moments of sleep. "High school history," Sarah confirmed. "I love it, even when my students try to convince me that everything they need to know is on Wikipedia." She smiled. "I try to teach them that history isn't just dates and battles. It's about real people making real choices, often under impossible circumstances." James nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly what being a Royal Guard has taught me in a way. People see us as rigid, emotionless, just part of the scenery. But every guard standing at that post is a real person with a story, a family, hopes, and fears. We choose to set aside our individual expressions for those hours because we're part of something larger than ourselves." "Like the people who worked in these rooms," Sarah said softly, gesturing around them. "They set aside their comfort, their safety, their normal lives." "Exactly." They continued through the museum, their conversation flowing easily from one topic to another. Sarah learned that James had served in Afghanistan before joining the Royal Guard, that he had a sister who was a veterinarian, and that he was teaching himself to play the piano, though he admitted he wasn't very good yet. James learned that Sarah had wanted to be an archaeologist as a child, that she'd never been outside the United States before this trip, and that she was terrified of heights but had made herself walk across Tower Bridge anyway. As they reached the end of the exhibition, Sarah realized she'd been in the museum for over 2 hours, most of that time spent talking with James. The awkwardness from their first encounter had completely evaporated, replaced by an easy rapport that surprised them both. They emerged into the daylight, blinking against the brightness after the dim underground rooms. James checked his watch, then looked at Sarah with what seemed like reluctance. "I should probably get going. I have some errands to run before my shift tomorrow." Sarah felt an unexpected disappointment but nodded with understanding. "Of course. Thank you for the company. You made the museum even more interesting than it already was." James hesitated, and Sarah could see him wrestling with something. Finally, he spoke. "Look, this might be completely inappropriate, and if you'd rather not, I completely understand. But would you like to get coffee sometime? When I'm not in uniform and you're not accidentally crossing security lines?" Sarah felt a smile spread across her face, genuine and warm. "I would like that very much. Though I should warn you, I'm only in London for 4 more days." "Then we shouldn't waste them," James replied, pulling out his phone. "Can I get your number?" As they exchanged contact information, Sarah noticed a few tourists walking past, cameras around their necks, heading toward Buckingham Palace. She thought about how strange life could be, How one embarrassing moment could somehow lead to this. Standing on a London street exchanging phone numbers with someone she never would have met otherwise. "I'll text you," James promised, as they prepared to part ways. "Maybe tomorrow evening? I know a quiet place near Covent Garden that makes the best fish and chips in London." "That sounds perfect," Sarah said, and meant it. They said goodbye and walked in opposite directions, but Sarah couldn't help glancing back once. She caught James doing the same thing, and they both laughed, a little embarrassed but mostly pleased. As Sarah made her way back to her hotel, she felt like she was floating. The embarrassment that had weighed on her for 3 days had transformed into something entirely different, something full of possibility. That evening, as she sat in her hotel room reviewing the photos from her trip, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's James. Just wanted to make sure I got your number right. Looking forward to tomorrow. Hope you don't mind, but I asked my sister what Americans like, and she said I should probably offer you options beyond fish and chips. So I have a backup plan if you prefer. Sleep well?" Sarah found herself grinning at her phone like a teenager. She typed back, "Fish and chips sounds wonderful. I came to London to experience everything authentically, and that includes the food recommendations from locals. See you tomorrow." His response came quickly. "Authentically it is. Fair warning though, I'm going to take you to the place where actual Londoners eat, not the tourist spots. It's not fancy." "Even better," Sarah wrote back. "Fancy is overrated." She set her phone down and looked out her hotel window at the London skyline. The city lights twinkled in the darkness, and somewhere out there, James was probably getting ready for bed, preparing for his shift at the palace tomorrow. It seemed surreal that the stern guard who had commanded her to step back was the same person who had spent 2 hours discussing history with her, who worried about whether she'd like his restaurant choice, who had admitted to being terrible at piano. Sarah thought about her students back home, about how she always told them that the best stories in history were about unexpected connections, about moments that changed the course of events in ways no one could have predicted. She never imagined she'd be living one of those moments herself. As she prepared for bed, Sarah made a mental note to thank her sister later for pushing her to take this trip. She'd almost canceled it 3 times, worried about the cost, worried about traveling alone, worried about a dozen things that seemed silly now. If she'd given in to those worries, she never would have crossed that line at the palace. And while crossing the line had been embarrassing, it had also been the beginning of something she couldn't quite name yet, but that felt important nonetheless. She fell asleep that night with a smile on her face, dreaming of underground war rooms and conversations with... The next evening, Sarah changed her outfit 4 times before finally settling on a simple blue dress and cardigan. She reminded herself this wasn't a date, just 2 people getting dinner, 2 new friends exploring the city together. But her racing heart and the extra time she spent on her makeup suggested otherwise. James had texted her the address and offered to meet her there, explaining that he lived on the other side of London, and it would be easier than trying to coordinate pickup. Sarah appreciated his thoughtfulness and took the underground to Covent Garden, emerging into the evening bustle of one of London's most vibrant neighborhoods. She found the restaurant tucked down a narrow side street, away from the main tourist areas. The sign above the door simply read, "The Copper Kettle" in faded letters, and through the windows she could see wooden tables and locals chatting over their meals. This was definitely not a tourist spot. James was already there, standing outside waiting for her. He wore dark jeans and a button-down shirt, and his face lit up when he saw her approaching. "You found it," he said warmly. "I was worried the directions might have been confusing." "Your instructions were perfect," Sarah assured him, noticing how different he looked when he smiled, how the sternness she'd first seen at the palace had been replaced by genuine warmth. Inside, the restaurant smelled of fried fish and vinegar, and the atmosphere was cozy and welcoming. An older woman behind the counter called out to James by name, and he waved back with obvious familiarity. They found a table by the window, and James insisted on ordering for both of them, promising Sarah she wouldn't regret trusting his judgment. As they waited for their food, the initial nervousness melted away. They picked up their conversation from the museum as if no time had passed, talking about everything and nothing. James told her about his decision to join the military, how it had been both the hardest and best choice of his life. Sarah shared stories about her students, the funny questions they asked, the moments when she could see understanding dawn in their eyes. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked as their food arrived. The fish and chips looking golden and perfect. Choosing a career that requires so much discipline and sacrifice? James considered the question while reaching for the salt. Sometimes, he admitted, when I'm standing in the rain for hours or when I miss a family event because of duty. But then I think about what it means to be part of something bigger than myself. The Royal Guard isn't just ceremonial. We're protecting living history, maintaining traditions that connect us to centuries of service and sacrifice. That matters to me. Sarah found herself watching him as he spoke, noticing the passion in his voice, the conviction in his eyes. You really believe in it, she said softly. I do. Maybe that makes me old-fashioned, but I think the world needs traditions, needs people willing to stand for something larger than their own comfort. He paused, then smiled self-consciously. Sorry, I'm probably sounding very serious. No, Sarah said quickly. I love that you're passionate about what you do. So many people just go through the motions. You actually care. They ate their meal and James was right, it was the best fish and chips Sarah had ever tasted. The conversation flowed from serious topics to lighter ones. James told her about the strangest things tourists had tried to do to make guards react, including one person who had brought a trained parrot that kept shouting phrases. Sarah shared her own embarrassing travel stories, including the time she'd gotten completely lost in Paris and accidentally ended up at a wedding reception where everyone was too polite to tell her she didn't belong there. After dinner, James suggested a walk through Covent Garden. The evening air was cool but pleasant, and the streets were alive with street performers and shoppers. They wandered without purpose, stopping occasionally to watch a musician or look in a shop window. Can I ask you something? Sarah said as they paused near a fountain where a violinist was playing a hauntingly beautiful melody. Why did you approach me at the museum? You could have just ignored me, pretended you didn't recognize me. James was quiet for a moment, watching the violinist. Honestly? I've been thinking about that myself. I think it was because of how you reacted that day at the palace. Most people, when they cross the line, they get defensive or angry or they just slink away. But you apologized, really apologized, like you understood that guards are people too. That stuck with me. He turned to look at her. And then seeing you at the museum, genuinely engaged with the history, taking time to read everything instead of just snapping photos and moving on. I found myself wanting to know more about you. Sarah felt her cheeks warm. I'm glad you did. This has been one of the best evenings I've had in London. Actually, one of the best evenings I've had in a long time, period. They continued walking and somehow their hands found each other. It happened so naturally that Sarah wasn't even sure who reached out first. They just ended up walking hand in hand through the streets of London. Two people from different worlds who had found an unexpected connection. As the evening grew later, James walked Sarah to the underground station. They stood outside the entrance, neither wanting to say goodbye, but both knowing they had to. When can I see you again? James asked. You said you have 4 more days. I have another day off on Sunday. Sunday sounds perfect, Sarah said, squeezing his hand gently. What should we do? Let me surprise you, James said with a mysterious smile. I'll pick you up at your hotel at 10 in the morning. Wear comfortable shoes and bring a jacket, Sarah laughed. That's very mysterious. I'm a man of mystery, James joked, then his expression turned more serious. Sarah, I know this is complicated. You're leaving in a few days and I live here, but I really enjoy spending time with you and I'd like to make the most of whatever time we have. Me too, Sarah admitted. Let's not overthink it. Let's just see where this goes. They said goodnight with a hug that lasted a little longer than a friendly hug should, and Sarah descended into the underground station with butterflies in her stomach. As the train carried her back to her hotel, she stared at her reflection in the dark window, seeing a woman who looked happier than she'd felt in years. Back in her hotel room, she called her sister despite the time difference. Her sister answered groggily but woke up quickly when Sarah started telling her about the evening. Wait, her sister said, now fully awake. You're going on dates with a royal guard? The same one who yelled at you? He didn't yell exactly, Sarah defended. He was doing his job. And yes, we're spending time together. I know it's crazy. It's not crazy, her sister said warmly. It's romantic. Like something out of a movie. But Sarah, be careful, okay? You're coming home in a few days. Don't let yourself get too attached if this can't go anywhere. After they hung up, Sarah lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her sister's words echoing in her mind. She knew the advice was sensible, practical, the kind of thing she would tell a friend in the same situation. But her heart wasn't listening to practical advice. Her heart was already several steps ahead, imagining possibilities that her rational mind knew were complicated at best. She thought about James, about the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, about how passionate he was about duty and tradition, about how gentle his hand had felt in hers. She thought about how easy it was to talk to him, how the conversation never felt forced or awkward, how 2 hours could feel like 20 minutes. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Thank you for tonight. I haven't enjoyed an evening that much in longer than I can remember. Sleep well. Sarah Mitchell from Boston." She smiled and typed back, "Thank you for showing me the real London. Can't wait for Sunday." "Sleep well, James Henderson, man of mystery." His response was a simple smiley face, which made Sarah laugh because it seemed so ordinary and sweet coming from someone who spent his days standing guard at a palace. Over the next 2 days, they texted constantly. James would send her photos during his breaks, silly pictures of pigeons that gathered near the palace, or shots of the sky between the buildings. Sarah sent him pictures from the British Museum, from the bookshops she explored, from the little cafe where she'd found the perfect cup of tea. They talked about books they loved and movies they'd seen. James admitted he was a huge fan of science fiction, which surprised Sarah. She confessed that she secretly enjoyed terrible reality television, which made James laugh. They discovered they both loved thunderstorms, both hated olives, and both had a weakness for old black and white films. On Saturday, Sarah visited the Tower of London, but even surrounded by centuries of history, she found her thoughts drifting to James and their upcoming Sunday adventure. She wondered where he would take her, what he had planned. More than that, she wondered what would happen when her trip ended, when she had to get on a plane and return to her real life in Boston. That evening, as she was getting ready for bed, James called instead of texting. "Hope it's not too late," he said when she answered. "I just wanted to hear your voice." They talked for over an hour, their conversation wandering from topic to topic with the ease of old friends rather than two people who had known each other for less than a week. James told her about a funny incident during his shift where a tourist's hat had blown off and landed on another guard's rifle. Sarah told him about an interesting conversation. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the promise of a perfect day. Sarah was ready at 9:45, pacing her hotel room in comfortable jeans, walking shoes, and a light jacket as instructed. When her phone buzzed at exactly 10 o'clock with a text saying James was downstairs, her heart did a little flip. She found him waiting in the lobby, looking relaxed in casual clothes with a backpack slung over one shoulder. His face brightened when he saw her coming down the stairs and he met her halfway, greeting her with a hug that felt both natural and thrilling. "Ready for your mystery adventure?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "I've been ready since yesterday," Sarah laughed. "The suspense has been killing me." "Good things come to those who wait," James teased as he led her outside to where his car was parked. It was an older model sedan, well-maintained but clearly practical rather than flashy, which somehow fit him perfectly. As they drove through London's streets, Sarah tried to guess their destination based on the direction they were heading. "Are we going to another museum?" she ventured. James just smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." They left the city center behind, heading into the countryside. The urban landscape gradually gave way to rolling green hills and quaint villages with stone cottages. Sarah watched the scenery change, feeling her curiosity grow with each passing mile. After about an hour, James turned down a smaller road and then onto a gravel driveway. At the end of the drive sat a beautiful old manor house, its honey-colored stone walls glowing in the morning sun. A discreet sign read, "Thornbury Manor and Gardens. We're going to a manor house," Sarah asked, delighted. "Not just any manor house," James said as he parked the car. "This one belonged to my great-great-grandmother's family. It's been converted into a heritage site now, but my family still has special visiting privileges. I thought you might enjoy seeing a piece of real English history that isn't crawling with tourists." Sarah was touched by the personal nature of the destination. "James, this is incredible. Thank you for sharing this with me." They got out of the car and James led her not to the main entrance but around to a side garden gate. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked it, explaining that this was the family entrance. The garden that greeted them was breathtaking, with perfectly manicured hedges, bursting flower beds, and winding stone pathways. "My great-great-grandmother used to paint here," James said as they walked through the garden. We still have some of her watercolors at home. She loved capturing the way the light fell on the roses in the morning. He showed her around the grounds first, pointing out the old oak tree where generations of children had played, the pond where his grandfather had learned to fish, the bench where his parents had gotten engaged. Every corner held a story, and James shared them all with obvious affection. "I can see why you value tradition so much," Sarah said as they sat on that same engagement bench, looking out over a meadow that stretched toward a distant tree line. "Having this connection to your past, to your family history, it makes everything feel more meaningful." "Exactly," James agreed. "When I'm standing guard at the palace, I'm not just doing a job. I'm part of a continuous line of people who've chosen to serve, to be part of something lasting. My family has been doing that in various ways for generations." After exploring the grounds, James led her inside the manor. Unlike the busy tourist attractions Sarah had visited, they had the place almost to themselves. A kind elderly caretaker named Mrs. Pembridge greeted James with obvious fondness, insisting on making them tea before they toured the house. Over tea and biscuits in the old kitchen, Mrs. Pembridge told stories about James as a boy, much to his embarrassment and Sarah's delight. "He used to hide in the library for hours," she shared with a conspiratorial smile, reading adventure books and pretending he was exploring ancient ruins. "I think I would have liked young James," Sarah said, grinning at his reddening face. "Young James would have been too shy to talk to you," James admitted. He barely talked to anyone except his sister and his books. After tea, they toured the manor properly. James showed her the library where he'd spent those childhood hours, the grand dining room where his family still gathered for special occasions, and the portrait gallery where stern-faced ancestors looked down from gilt frames. Sarah stopped in front of one portrait in particular, a woman in Victorian dress with kind eyes and a slight smile. "That's my great-great-grandmother," James said softly. "The one who painted. Her name was Elizabeth." "She's beautiful," Sarah said, "and she looks like she had a sense of humor, even in such a formal portrait." Everyone said she did. Apparently, she scandalized the family by insisting on painting outdoors instead of doing needlework like proper ladies were supposed to. My grandfather loved telling stories about her. They spent hours exploring the manor, with James sharing family stories and historical details. Sarah was in her element, asking questions about the architecture, the social history, the daily lives of the people who had lived there. James matched her enthusiasm, clearly happy to share this piece of his heritage with someone who truly appreciated it. For lunch, they had the picnic James had packed in his backpack, eating on a blanket in the garden. He'd brought sandwiches, fruit, cheese, and even a small bottle of wine. As they ate, surrounded by flowers and history, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of contentment. "I need to tell you something," James said as they were finishing their meal. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happens when you go home." Sarah's heart began to race. "Okay," she said carefully. "I know we've only known each other for a few days. I know that by any logical measure this is moving too fast. But Sarah, I haven't felt this way about anyone in years, maybe ever." He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "When you go back to Boston, I don't want to just try to maintain a long-distance friendship. I want more than that. I want to actually pursue this, to see if what we have is as real as it feels." Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes. "James, I want that too. But I live across an ocean. I have a job, a lease, a life in Boston, and you have your career here, your family, your responsibilities." "I know," James said. "I'm not suggesting either of us give up our lives, but people make long-distance relationships work all the time. We could visit each other. Video calls, messages, planning trips. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is." "And what if it doesn't work?" Sarah asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. "What if we try and the distance is too much? What if we end up hurting each other?" James moved closer, cupping her face gently with his free hand. "Then at least we'll know we tried." "But Sarah, what if it does work? What if this is the beginning of something amazing? I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been because I was too afraid to take a chance." Sarah looked into his eyes and saw sincerity, hope, and a vulnerability that matched her own. She thought about all the lessons she taught her students about history, about how the most important moments often required courage, required people to step into uncertainty without knowing the outcome. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. Let's really try. James's face broke into a brilliant smile, and then he was kissing her, gentle and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were grinning like teenagers. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the garden making plans. James could request time off to visit Boston during the winter holidays. Sarah could come back to London during her summer break from teaching. They would video call every week, text daily, and send each other care packages with little reminders of home. I want to meet your sister, James said, and hear more stories about your students. I want to know what your apartment looks like and what you do on Sunday mornings and what kind of coffee you drink. I want to meet your family too, Sarah said, and see where you live and learn about your piano playing even if you say you're terrible. Especially because I'm terrible, James corrected with a laugh. It builds character to be bad at something. As the sun began to set, they packed up their picnic and said goodbye to Mrs. Pembridge, who gave Sarah a warm hug and whispered, "He's a good boy. Take care of him." On the drive back to London, Sarah rested her hand on James's knee, feeling the solid reality of him, trying to memorize every detail of this day. Tomorrow was Monday, and she still had 2 more days in London before her flight home on Thursday. 2 more days to spend with James to build memories that would have to sustain them until they could see each other again. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, glancing at her as they stopped at a traffic light. "How much can change in a week?" Sarah admitted. 7 days ago I was just a tourist who embarrassed herself at the palace. Now I'm sitting here making plans for a long-distance relationship with someone I never expected to meet. Funny how life works, James agreed. 7 days ago I was standing at my post doing my job, thinking about what I'd have for dinner. I had no idea that the woman who crossed that line would end up meaning something to me. "Do you think we're crazy?" Sarah asked. "Everyone we tell about this is going to think we're rushing into something." "Maybe we are," James said. "But you know what? I'd rather be crazy and happy." Monday arrived too quickly. Sarah spent the morning at the British Library, but her mind kept wandering to James, who was at his post at the palace. She wondered if he was thinking about her too, if he was remembering yesterday's perfect day at the manor, if he was counting down the hours until his shift ended. Around 3 in the afternoon, her phone buzzed with a text. "Shift's over. Are you free? I have an idea for tonight." Sarah smiled and typed back immediately. "Always free for you." "What's the idea?" "Meet me at the palace gates at 5. Wear something comfortable. And trust me." Intrigued, Sarah headed back to her hotel to change. She chose comfortable clothes and was standing at the palace gates by 4:55, watching tourists take photos and guards stand at attention. She found herself looking at them differently now, seeing them not as attractions but as people like James, with lives and stories and families waiting for them at home. James appeared right at 5. Now in civilian clothes, his face lighting up when he spotted her. He greeted her with a kiss that made a few nearby tourists whistle, and he laughed, not embarrassed but proud to be showing affection to her. "So what's this mysterious plan?" Sarah asked as they walked away from the palace. "You'll see in about 20 minutes, James said mysteriously, leading her through streets she hadn't explored yet. They ended up at what looked like an ordinary apartment building in a quiet residential neighborhood. James led her inside and up 3 flights of stairs, then stopped in front of a blue door marked with the number 12. "Welcome to my humble home," he said, unlocking the door. "I wanted you to see where I actually live, not just the tourist spots." "Is that okay?" "More than okay," Sarah assured him, touched that he wanted to share this part of his life with her. James's flat was modest but cozy. The living room had a comfortable sofa, bookshelves crammed with novels and history books, and a small keyboard in the corner that must have been the piano he'd mentioned. Photos covered one wall, family pictures and shots from his military service. A window looked out over a small park where children were playing. "It's perfect," Sarah said, meaning it. The space felt like James, organized but lived in, practical but warm. "I thought we could cook dinner together," James said, leading her to the kitchen. "Nothing fancy, just pasta and salad, but I wanted to give you a normal evening. Not tourist Sarah and royal guard James. Just us being regular people spending time together." They cooked side by side in his small kitchen, bumping into each other in the limited space and laughing when Sarah accidentally knocked over the salt. James told her about his neighborhood, the cafe where he got coffee every morning, the park where he ran in the evenings, the little corner shop run by an elderly Indian couple who always asked about his mother. Over dinner at his small table, they talked about practical things they hadn't addressed yet. Time zones, the 6-hour difference between London and Boston, the cost of flights and how often they could realistically afford to visit. Video call schedules that would work around both their jobs. "I've been thinking," James said as they cleared the dishes. "Maybe we should set some ground rules. Things we both commit to so we're on the same page." "That's a good idea," Sarah agreed. "What did you have in mind?" They moved to the sofa, and James pulled out his phone, opening a notes app. "Okay, so first, honest communication. If something's bothering one of us, we talk about it instead of letting it fester. Distance makes that even more important." Sarah nodded. "Agreed, what else?" "Regular video calls. At least twice a week on days we both commit to. Not just quick chats, but real conversations where we give each other our full attention." "I like that," Sarah said. "What about visits? How often do you think we can manage?" They spent the next hour hashing out details, being realistic about money and time off work, while also making sure they had concrete plans to look forward to. James would visit Boston in December around the holidays. Sarah would come back to London during her spring break in April. They would reassess after that, see how things were going, make plans for the summer. "What about telling people?" Sarah asked. "Your family, my friends. Are we keeping this quiet or being open about it?" "I want to tell people," James said firmly. "I'm not interested in hiding you or pretending this isn't important to me. My family is going to love you, by the way. My sister has already been asking questions after I mentioned meeting someone." "You told your sister about me?" Sarah asked, surprised and pleased. "Of course I did. The day after we had dinner at the fish and chips place, she called and could tell something was different. I've never been good at hiding things from her." He smiled. "She made me promise to introduce you before you leave London." "I'd love to meet her," Sarah said warmly. Then more hesitantly, "What about your colleagues? The other guards?" James was quiet for a moment. "Some of them will understand. Others might think I'm making a mistake, getting involved with someone who lives so far away. But their opinions don't matter as much as how I feel. And I feel like this is right, Sarah. I feel like you're worth the risk." Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. "I feel that way too. It's scary, but it's also exciting. I've never done anything like this before." "Neither have I," James admitted. "My longest relationship lasted 6 months and was with someone who lived 10 minutes away. This is completely new territory for me." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, just being together. Eventually, James showed her his photo albums, both physical and digital. Pictures of his childhood, his military service, his family. Sarah shared photos on her phone too, showing him her classroom, her apartment, her cat named Dickens, her students on various field trips. "Wait, go back," James said suddenly. "You have a cat?" "You never mentioned a cat," Sarah laughed. "I have a cat. Dickens is very dignified and only tolerates me because I feed him. My neighbor's been watching him while I'm here." "I love cats," James said, studying the photo. "That's good to know. What else haven't you told me?" They spent the evening sharing small details about their lives, the everyday things that defined them. Sarah learned that James was hopeless at gardening, but kept trying anyway. That he sang in the shower but only when alone. That he had a weakness for chocolate biscuits and would eat an entire package in one sitting if not careful. James learned that Sarah talked to herself when she was thinking. That she couldn't function without at least 2 cups of coffee in the morning. That she'd been writing a novel in her spare time for 3 years but was too scared to let anyone read it. "I'd love to read it," James said. "When you're ready. No pressure." As the evening grew late, they cuddled on the sofa watching an old movie neither of them really paid attention to. Sarah kept glancing around the flat, memorizing details. She wanted to be able to picture James here when she was back in Boston. Wanted to imagine him making coffee in that kitchen, reading on that sofa, playing his keyboard by the window. "Stay," James said softly, breaking into her thoughts. "I mean just to sleep. I'm not trying to pressure you or assume anything. But it's late, and I don't want you traveling across London alone in the dark. You can have the bedroom, I'll take the sofa." Sarah considered for a moment, then shook her head. "I'll stay, but I'm not kicking you out of your own bed. We're adults. We can share a bed without making it complicated." James looked uncertain but hopeful. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Besides, we only have 2 more days together before I leave. I don't want to waste time being apart when we could be together." They got ready for bed with an awkwardness that was both endearing and a little funny. James lent her a t-shirt to sleep in. and they took turns in the bathroom. When they finally settled into bed, there was a moment of nervous uncertainty before Sarah moved closer, and James wrapped his arm around her. "This okay?" he asked softly. "Perfect," Sarah whispered back, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek. They talked quietly in the darkness, sharing fears and hopes for their future together. James admitted he was worried about not being enough from across the ocean, about Sarah meeting someone else in Boston who could actually be there for her. Sarah confessed she was scared of the loneliness, of missing him so much it hurt, of the relationship becoming just words on a screen instead of something real and tangible. "We'll figure it out," James promised. "It won't be perfect, but we'll make it work. And every time we see each other, it'll be worth all the missing and waiting." "Promise?" Sarah asked. "I promise," James said, kissing her forehead gently. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, holding on tight as if they could stop time from moving forward. Stop Thursday from coming. Stop the inevitable goodbye that was approaching too quickly. Sarah woke up Tuesday morning to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment she was disoriented. Then she remembered where she was and smiled. She could hear James moving around in the kitchen, hear him humming softly to himself. She got up and found him making breakfast, still in his pajamas, his hair adorably messy. He turned when he heard her and smiled, a soft, intimate smile that made her heart flip. "Morning," he said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "I remembered you said you needed at least 2 cups, so I made a full pot." "You're perfect," Sarah said, accepting the mug gratefully. They had breakfast together, comfortable. Wednesday morning came too soon and felt too final. Sarah woke before James, watching him sleep in the early morning light. She thought about how much had changed in just 1 week, how this man who had been a stranger was now someone she couldn't imagine her life without. James stirred and opened his eyes, immediately reaching for her. "Morning," he mumbled sleepily. "What time is it?" "Early," Sarah whispered. "Your alarm hasn't gone off yet. I just wanted to watch you for a bit." He smiled and pulled her closer. "That's not creepy at all," he teased gently. "We leave for the airport at 6 tomorrow morning," Sarah said quietly. "This is our last full day." James was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I know I've been trying not to think about it. But Sarah, this isn't an ending. It's just the next chapter." "I know," she agreed. "But I'm still going to miss you terribly. I'll miss you too. Every single day. But we have a plan. We have commitments to each other, and we have something real. That's more than most people get." James had requested the day off from his duties, something he rarely did, so they could spend every minute together. After a lazy breakfast, they decided to revisit some of the places that had become special to them. First, the Churchill War Rooms, where they'd first really met. They walked through the exhibits again, but this time holding hands, remembering their conversation that had started everything. Then they went to the Palace Gardens, staying carefully behind the lines, watching the changing of the guard. Sarah pointed out the spot where she'd crossed the line, where this whole unexpected journey had begun. "Best mistake I ever made," she said softly. "Same," James agreed, squeezing her hand. They had lunch at the Copper Kettle, where Mrs. Henderson at the counter remembered them and winked knowingly. They walked through Covent Garden, stopping to listen to street musicians and browse through shops, not really buying anything, just soaking in the experience of being together in this city that had brought them together. As afternoon turned to evening, they returned to James's flat. The reality of goodbye was settling over them like a heavy blanket, making everything feel more precious and fragile. Sarah's suitcase sat by the door, packed and ready, a visible reminder of her departure. "I have something for you," James said, disappearing into his bedroom and returning with a small wrapped package. "Open it." Sarah carefully unwrapped the paper to find a leather journal, beautiful and well-made, with her initials embossed on the cover. Inside the front cover, James had written a note in his neat handwriting. "For all the stories yet to be written, some will be mine to hear about, some will be yours alone, but all of them will be part of the journey that brought us together and keeps us connected. Write about your days, your thoughts, your dreams, and when we see each other again, we'll share the pages we're ready to share. Until then, know that you're in my thoughts constantly. Love, James." Sarah felt tears spill down her cheeks. "James, this is beautiful. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he said gently, wiping her tears away. I just wanted you to have something from me, something personal and meaningful. I have something for you too, Sarah said, going to her suitcase and pulling out a package she'd wrapped the day before. I bought it yesterday when you were on duty. James opened it to find a framed photograph. It was one Sarah had taken on their first day at the Churchill War Rooms, a candid shot of James looking at one of the exhibits, his expression thoughtful and engaged. She'd had it printed and framed at a shop near her hotel. So you can remember the day we chose to take a chance, she explained. The day we decided to be brave. James studied the photo, his eyes bright with emotion. I love it. I'll keep it on my bedside table so it's the first thing I see every morning and the last thing I see at night. They held each other for a long time, neither speaking, both trying to memorize the feel of this moment. Eventually, they ordered takeaway dinner and ate it sitting on the floor of James's living room, leaning against the sofa, their shoulders touching. Tell me something, James said as they finished eating. Something you're looking forward to when I visit Boston in December, Sarah thought for a moment. Showing you my favorite bookshop. It's this tiny, cramped place that smells like old paper and coffee, and the owner has the worst filing system imaginable, but I love it. And I want to take you ice skating on the common, even though I'm terrible at it and will probably fall constantly. And I want you to meet my students, see where I work, understand that part of my life. I can't wait, James said sincerely. Your turn. What are you looking forward to when you come back in April? Meeting more of your family. Seeing the manor again when the gardens are in full spring bloom. Maybe taking a trip outside London, seeing more of England. She paused, but mostly just being with you again. Not having to say goodbye at the end of every day, they talked late into the night, making promises and plans, reassuring each other that this would work, that the distance was temporary, that what they had was worth fighting for. Around midnight, James taught Sarah a few chords on his keyboard. Laughing at her complete lack of musical ability, Sarah read him the first chapter of her novel, something she'd never done for anyone and felt proud when he asked for more. Finally, knowing they had to get up early, they went to bed. Sarah set her alarm for 5, giving them enough time to get ready and drive to the airport. As they lay in the darkness, wrapped around each other, Sarah felt the weight of goodbye pressing down on her chest. I'm scared, she admitted quietly. What if being apart is too hard? What if we can't make it work? Then we'll deal with it together, James said firmly. But Sarah, I believe in us. I believe in what we have. And I promise you, I'm going to put in the work. This isn't just words for me. I'm committed to making this relationship a priority. Me too, Sarah whispered. I promise. They fell into a restless sleep, holding each other tight, neither wanting to let go. The alarm came too soon. In the pre-dawn darkness, they moved quietly around the flat, getting dressed, drinking coffee, double-checking that Sarah had everything. The drive to the airport was mostly silent, both of them lost in their own thoughts, hands clasped tightly over the center console. At the airport, James parked and insisted on walking Sarah inside. They checked her bags and got her boarding pass, going through all the mundane tasks that suddenly felt monumental because they marked the final countdown. Finally, they reached security, the point where James couldn't go any further. They stood facing each other, surrounded by travelers rushing past, but it felt like they were in their own world. This is it, Sarah said, her voice breaking slightly. For now, anyway. James cupped her face in his hands, his eyes intense and serious. Listen to me. What we have is real. The distance doesn't change that. We're going to make this work, Sarah Mitchell. We're going to prove that some things are worth fighting for, worth being patient for, worth believing in even when it's hard. I love you, Sarah said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. I know it's too soon. I know we've only known each other a week, but I love you, James Henderson. I need you to know that before I go. James's face broke into a brilliant smile, even as tears gathered in his eyes. I love you too. I've been wanting to say it for days, but was afraid it was too fast. But it doesn't feel too fast. It feels exactly right. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, not caring about the people walking around them, not caring about anything except this moment, this goodbye that wasn't really goodbye, this ending that was really a beginning. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying and smiling at the same time. December, James said firmly. 74 days. I'm already counting. 74 days, Sarah repeated. I'll be counting too. One more hug, one more kiss, and then Sarah forced herself to step back, to turn around, to walk toward security. She made it 3 steps before turning back, and James was still there, watching her, his hand raised in farewell. She blew him a kiss. He caught it dramatically and pressed it to his heart, making her laugh through her tears. Then she turned and walked through security, joining the line, going through the motions automatically. She made herself not look back again, knowing that if she did, she might not be able to keep walking. On the plane, buckled into her seat as the engines roared to life, Sarah pulled out the journal James had given her. On the first page, she began to write. This is the story of how I crossed a line I shouldn't have crossed, and how that mistake led me to the love I'd been waiting for my whole life, without knowing it. This is the story of a week in London that changed everything. This is the story of James, of his blue eyes and his dedication to duty and his terrible piano playing and his beautiful heart. This is the story of choosing to be brave, of believing in something even when it's terrifying, of trusting that love can exist across oceans and time zones. This is the story of us, and it's just beginning. The plane lifted into the air, carrying Sarah away from London, away from James, back to Boston and her regular life. But as she looked out the window at the clouds below, she didn't feel like she was leaving something behind. She felt like she was carrying something precious with her, something that would sustain her through the hard days ahead, something worth every challenge that lay before them. 2 months later, Sarah stood in,